Morning. Are you happy? Yes. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Okay. That's super, but we can make it better. This is an experiment, and to get the experiment really right, it's us clapping and us singing, not me singing and us clapping. Are you with me on that? Okay. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it and you really want to show it, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Super. That's impressive. The only group that was louder than that doing that was 1,000 Romans. But that's pretty good because you were 500 Canadians, so you were per capita louder and better singers than they were. So that's very impressive. I do this for scientific purposes. So my next question is, are you happier than you were 2 minutes ago? Yes. Okay. Well, you knew what I was asking when I asked, were you happier now than 2 minutes ago? And you all gave clear answers, even if you said, no, I'm embarrassed by having to sing. So not all of you were happier, but most of you were. That's very common because we were doing something together. It wasn't you listening and me talking. It was us doing something together. That's a very strong source of happiness. The second part of the science in me asking that question is to make a really important distinction between happiness as an emotion, which you knew I was asking about and you answered, to a quite different question, which is deeper and more fundamental. There are 3 different ways of approaching happiness, and I'm speaking now as Aristotle's research assistant, because when I took up this field 15 or 20 years ago, I went right to the master and took the word, and have been testing it ever since. And what he said was, the key question, if you want to find out about someone's life, is you ask them in a reflective moment to think about their life and to say how good it is and how good they expect it to be. And he said, my guess is, and he said, if this does not pass the test of the world, it is mere theory. Essentially, it's for others to come along and see if it really works. The fundamental features of life characteristics, and this will be 6 factors I'm going to tell you about in a moment that appear to be important in the world today, and he had them all right. Oh, shall I give them to you now? Okay, because I may lose my track other time if I don't nail them down quite quickly. The first 2 are very natural and easy because if you ever thought about human development in the way it's discussed in the world, they're kind of gimmies. One is income and the other is healthy life expectancy. So those are 2 of the 6. Now, the other 4 are really where all the action is. It's where the world needs to think more about and has not thought enough about. And they're all inherently social, but getting at life in different ways. So the first one I think of as opportunity. Now, Amartya Sen, the great philosopher and economist, regarded it as capabilities. And the question that's asked in the Gallup World Poll that we use as our best measure of this opportunity is, how free are you to make your key life decisions? When you think about it, that's the kind of definition that really makes sense across cultures and over time. So that's opportunity, or freedom, if you like. Another is caring, and caring for others, and being cared for. Now, in the Gallup World Poll, the question is, in times of trouble, do you have somebody family or friends to count on? Now, it's a pretty limited question. It's just anybody. And you'd think everybody would have somebody, but it turns out even in the most tightly connected countries of the world, it gets up in the high 90s, but there are countries where it's as low as half the population don't have someone to count on in times of trouble. And that's an extraordinarily important thing. And these are all on Aristotle's list. The third, and it's really important, is trust. We know a lot about trust, but typically, and I'm going to give you a moment on trust at the moment, is that trust and trustworthiness is much higher than people think it is. Well, if that's true, then we're really shooting ourselves in the foot because we're not as happy as we should be. People love living in an environment where they trust the people around them to think of their best interests and to help them. How do I know that we're not as trusting of others as we should be? Because when we were starting doing surveys on this about 15 years ago, some of my skeptical friends, you just can't ask people how trustworthy are people. You've got to give them something specific. So we said, okay, here's something. Is this specific enough for you? We said, if you were to drop a wallet with $200 in it in the street, how likely is it to be returned if it was found by a neighbor, a police officer, a stranger, or a clerk in a local store? And you got answers to all of those. So that ended up getting in the General Social Survey in Canada. So fast forward 15 years, and a Toronto Star, without realizing this scientific base was being built up, went out and dropped 20 wallets in Toronto. Of course, they're all found by strangers because the owner was an imaginary person. Torontonians, to a narrow range, thought the likelihood of their lost wallets being returned was 25%. How many wallets do you think are returned? 0. You see, I see a 0 there. 16 out of 20. 80%. Now, if you do the math, the 20 is a small number. The other number was a big number. And you say, what is the probability of people being wrong about the world they're living in, or put it the other way around? What is the probability the real world is as bad as they think it is? Now, not bad. It's not terrible that your wallet only comes back a quarter of the time, but the point is it was coming back more than 3/4 of the time. The chances of those two being the same world are less than 1 in 8 billion. So it means, and this was a lovely matched experiment, right? Because we were asking people about exactly the experiment that was run. So it was what they call a perfect natural experiment. And it turns out, and we always had felt this, that people, in fact, underestimated the trustworthiness of others. Now, that's really important, because if you don't trust people, then you drive your kids to school. If you don't trust people, you don't talk to people in the street. If you don't trust people, you don't reach out to help others in the way that you'd like to do and that they would like to be reached out to. So trust is an absolutely critical form of social glue. And of course, on top of that, it simply makes you happier. Now, if I've followed my list correctly, I'm down to 5, and you're waiting to see what the 6th one is. And the 6th one is one which in development studies and in psychology generally has really been ignored. And it's giving. People really like the chance to do things for others. And of course, that changes the whole model, right? It says you treat mental patients not by giving professional carers to come along and look after them. You make a situation in halfway houses and others where they look after each other. And I've talked to people who run facilities, and they've said the people who get better fastest are the ones that are given the chance to help others. Because, of course, what you really want is a chance to this clock is counting up, not down. I was worrying for a moment there. What people really want is a chance to engage with others and to connect. And to connect for a good cause. Well, of course, that's a very good cause. Now, can I come back to Aristotle? Aristotle thought all those 6 things were important. But he said there's more than that. He said that's going to be supported also, on the one hand, by a balance of emotions, positive emotions. And it turns out that's really true. So that the emerging science of positive psychology. Remember, 30 years ago, psychology, 95% of the literature was about the identification and the treatment of depressive states of mind. They said it can't be right. Depressive states of mind, or absence of them, aren't the same as positive states of mind. And lo and behold, they then started finding, when they took students away and exposed them to a variable amount of a rhinovirus, that's a cold germ to you and me, and they measured their positive affect before, their state of their positive emotions, and they measured their negative affect before, and they said, how bad did they get the cold, and do they get the cold? Turns out that those with high positive affect were much less likely to get the cold, and if they got the cold, it would be much less serious. Flip the coin, if all your doctor had been asking about is your negative affect, it has a very much smaller right sign, right? If you're less depressed, you're less likely to get sick. But it's a much smaller effect than is the effect of positive emotions. And there's increasing evidence building up that it's the extent of those positive emotions that insulate you from a lot of bad health things. And of course, I've emphasized the other side of it. Those positive emotions themselves lead you to reach out and help other people. So the other side, I'm still with Aristotle, right? We've got the 6 things in the middle, which are the basics of life. On the one hand, we've got this balance of positive emotions. In other words, the Epicureans were right. To be happy is a good thing. To laugh is a good thing. There's no question about it. Positive turns up, there's lots of laughter cure studies and so on. Well, on the other side, he said it's really important to have a sense of life purpose. And that wasn't in any of those 6, was it? It wasn't there. And he said it really is important, and he's absolutely right. Now, I can tell you one recently acquired story. The night before last, I was at a dinner for Jeffrey Sachs, who was one of the editors of the World Happiness Report. But much more importantly, he is probably the key person responsible for the operation of the Millennial Development Goals between 2000 and 2015, and the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 to 2030. And one of the people who was actually sponsoring this talk he gave at UBC, and naturally was at the dinner, was a lovely man who I'd never met before, and his name was Daniel Germain. And he was looking for a purpose in life, but not thinking of it in those terms some while ago, when he was just a little bit older than you are, and he was in Mexico, and he saw a lot of starving children, and he said, this can't be right that children are starving, because it's not their fault. And if they're essentially to end up with those 6 things, they need a better start. So he came back to Canada, and he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to see if there are any schools around where there are children who don't have enough to eat for breakfast. And so at least locally and near me, I can do something about making sure that they have enough food in their tummies that they can follow the lessons, because by the time lunchtime comes around, this teaching day is mainly done. And if they haven't been able to follow that, then they're going to be stuck back where they were at the beginning. And that was now almost 20 years ago, I think. And every day now, right across Canada, 160,000 children are being fed breakfast in selected schools, in and out, in cities, out of cities, on reservations right around the country. Oh, that's an incredible thing. Do you hear about it? No, it's called the Breakfast Club Canada. But look it up on the web. They're always looking for volunteers. The whole thing, but the beauty of it all fits into this happiness agenda absolutely perfectly. It was all done, and I asked him. And he said, well, I didn't ask him. He said this. He said, I feel I have a real purpose in my life. And he would have had to have, right, to have done that. And he's devoted his whole life to this. And it's his purpose. And you can see it just shines out of him that he's doing something that's important. Well, it's classic story for me to recount to you, because he didn't have to wait for anyone to come along and provide him any resources. He didn't have to go and give speeches and raise a big public outcry and pass laws in Parliament and get government money to do it. He just started doing it. And of course, that enabled others who saw the magic that was happening to come in their small-scale way. It started from nothing, and it just grew and grew because other people said, we want to help. So now the whole thing has never had any government money. It's all been run just from the ground up, getting bigger and bigger. And of course, it's as much value for us to hear a story like that as it is for those children to get those meals. And so he found something. So it's the classic case, right? Find anything that needs doing, get people to work together, right? It's the singing together, but it's the singing together for somebody else and a better purpose, and that gives the real magic. And of course, the other feature of it is you've got to, in his case, have enough capacity. He didn't have any of the advantages most of us have had when he was growing up. He'd been a foster child who didn't have the same kind of stable life otherwise, but he's obviously as human as everybody is and as capable as everybody is for acquiring and using those key characteristics. Okay, now it turns out those 6 factors I've talked about explain 85% of the differences across countries over time of what are the happy countries and what are the unhappy countries. So it ranges on a scale of 10 from the peak in mainly Northern Europe, with Canada coming in pretty high at number 5 or 6 typically, down to average of below 3 in some war-torn countries in Southern Africa. And of course, in order to make better lives, you don't just bring more income, although that's part of it. You certainly bring better health, but you enable the people in those countries, in fact, to live better lives on all those other dimensions and help them to do so. Now, the theme of this symposium is about reacting in a changing world. So one of the studies we've been doing in the last few years is to look at resilience and say, to what extent are the kinds of assets, the sense I'm talking about, permit you to be more resilient? And it turns out there's a very big effect. Let me give you 2 examples, 3 if I'm lucky. The first one is what happened after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Well, you've heard about Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, of them dropping substantially in income and a whole range of connectedness. There are drops in life satisfaction, this kind of general Aristotelian term I'm talking about. How do you value your life on a scale of 0 to 10? They have fallen much more than can be explained by their losses in income and their rises in unemployment, according to the empirical work we've done. And that's understandable, because what else have they lost? They've lost the feeling that they were working together to solve an important problem. They're still fighting with each other and with others rather than addressing the problem. And so if the social fabric is not strong enough, connected enough to give you that capacity, then you're not going to deal with crises as well. Well, if I'm going to be convincing, you'll want me to give you an example on the other side of countries who went through something just as bad and didn't suffer the same well-being hit because they did have the capacity to work together to deal with it. Okay, so think Ireland and Iceland, both of which had a much bigger original decimation of their financial system than any of the other 4 countries I mentioned. And Iceland still sits now even higher than it was, number 2 in the ranking of the world's happiest countries, and Ireland suffered hardly at all. And the reason is they had this terrible shock, and they had lots of blame to throw around, but they immediately started working together to make sure it wouldn't happen again in Iceland's patch, and B, to work together to make lives better. Now, one interesting fact is, if you rank all the countries of the world in terms of their answers to the question, do you have someone to count on in times of trouble? The 2 highest countries in the world are Ireland and Iceland. And it was that kind of connection, the feeling that they could count on people around them, that gave them the capacity to, in fact, respond when change was required, and to make those changes, not to blame each other, not to fight each other, but to work together to try and repair things. Ditto, the Fukushima Great Japan East earthquake and tsunami, people in that region were actually happier after than before. You say, how could that be with the decimation of property and life? And the answer is, they found they had a much greater capacity to rush in and help each other than even they thought they had. And that made them feel good. It gave them the chance to work with and for others to rebuild. And that was such a strong support for giving them purpose, giving them connections with others to do important things. It was big enough to overpower the very big effects of those damages. Similarly true after the 2004 tsunami, the same kind of thing happened. I have many more of these stories, but the time has slipped, and I must say goodbye.